Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the UBC Learning Circle, hosted by the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health. We have Harley Eagle here today to talk about embracing the critical consciousness theory in Indigenous contexts, so talking about racism and systemic racism and oppression. I'd first like to start by acknowledging the unceded ancestral lands of the Musqueam people, who we're currently hosting this session from. I'd also like to thank the First Nations Health Authority for generously funding the Learning Circle, and to remind those that have been to this circle before and those that are new that some of the Learning Circle topics can be a bit emotionally sensitive or triggering, and so please make sure that you're looking after yourself today. If you feel you need some extra support, and talk to a friend or a colleague or a trusted elder or a counselor. I'd like to introduce myself now. My name's Melanie Rivers. I'm from the Squamish Nation. My Statlium name is Mlamawit, which means medicine. And I've been working in Indigenous health, education and policy for many years in different capacities. Very passionate about this work and working to increase the health and well-being of Indigenous peoples. So welcome, everyone. And so I'll introduce Harley now. So Harley Eagle is Dakota and Ojibwe and a member of the Whitecap Dakota First Nation. He looks to Indigenous life ways to guide his work. His experience includes training and consultation in the fields of transforming conflict, anti-racism, dismantling oppression, cultural safety, and trauma healing. He is often invited to speak at conferences both nationally and internationally. Harley holds a Master's of Arts in Conflict Analysis and Management and currently resides on Vancouver Island. So really pleased to welcome Harley today. He's traveled over from the island to be here. Really looking forward to your session today. So I'll pass it over to you now.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you for everybody out there that's decided to join in today to talk about this subject matter around critical consciousness. I'm just going to start my PowerPoint now to help me guide my words today. I certainly want to add my acknowledgement to the Musqueam people. It's wonderful to be here in this territory. And I also want to thank the UBC Learning Circle for inviting me here today. I continue to grow in my own journey from meeting all sorts of people all across BC, all across Canada, and really the world, who are trying to do something about this position that we find ourselves in as Indigenous people, and the colonial context, if you will. And I really appreciate those people, those movers and shakers, and the people that are all across walks of life who are trying to actually do something about it. And so and really that involves a lot of critical consciousness that needs to happen. So that's what we're going to delve in today, and I just want to thank all of those people that are I know behind me, and who's a lot of their work I stand on and learn from them, and will continue to learn. Really I'm talking about all of the influences in my life here that I want to acknowledge, those that come from my cultural background, and those that I've walked with for many years now. Some of them have passed on. Others perhaps we're not in close relationship, but there's so much that I've learned over the years that I continue to build on and continue to grow from. And then certainly presently I want to acknowledge those people that are close to me in my life, my partner and my children, and all of the people that I work with currently over at Island Health, doing cultural safety work. There's many people that I have the profound opportunity to interact with and walk along on this journey with, that again I continue to learn from as well. And I also want to acknowledge for all of us that are doing this work, trying to create a different future, not only for our children and grandchildren and future generations, but also this land. How do we consider the land and all of this, and what are our actions going to be now, in the now, that will affect the future and our relationship with the land and how we walk upon the land. I also want to acknowledge that this isn't the easiest way of interacting on a subject like critical consciousness. Talking via technology is wonderful. It has it absolutely has its benefits, but it's also a challenging way. And I much prefer dialogue. I much prefer being in face to face with people, either in circle or having coffee together or sharing a meal or just being with people and having these deep conversations. That's the ideal. And I certainly recognize that this kind of format often takes us into our head, into the intellect, and sometimes we get stuck there, and these conversations take place in that format, when really they need to take place in all of our being, recognizing our history and the impacts within our bodies, the impacts on our spirits and emotions and those kinds of things, and also the strengths that come from those places, in a holistic way. That can happen when you're face to face and in certain processes that help to establish that. And so I recognize that this isn't the easiest and best way of having this conversation, but it's wonderful that we get to have this conversation as well. And thank you for acknowledging the nature of this conversation can be very difficult. So thank you for suggesting to people to make sure you look after yourself. And also, as we're talking today, please notice when something is coming up for you. Perhaps you're feeling slightly triggered, or you're reacting to something that I may say, or perhaps in our conversations later that somebody else may say. Please notice that when that's happening, and if you could, in this session, to ask yourself, what is it about me that has me reacting to this in this way? And I'm saying this really because that's a part of this journey of critical consciousness. It's about noticing the impacts. It's about noticing our feelings and our emotions and our reactions to various and many situations that we find ourselves in. That's a part of this journey of critical consciousness. So I would hope that you can embrace that for this dialogue session, to notice when you're having that kind of internal reaction. So just very quickly, Melanie's already talked about the objectives for this session. These objectives really came out of a conversation with folks here at UBC Learning Circle, and it's a bit of a collaboration of trying to figure out, so what would be the best thing to talk about here in this call. And so these objectives were established collaboratively, I would like to point out. So we will delve into my own experiences and understandings of systemic racism, and I certainly say this intentionally. Systemic racism. We want to look at a bigger picture of what's been going on and the climate and the environment that we find ourselves in. And that's related to this thing called racism and oppression. And so we'll talk about that and talk about some of the theory behind racism, systemic racism, and explore its possible roots. Because racism is something that we probably talk about just about every day of our lives, several times a day, and we hear about incidences of racism. But really, I don't think we understand fully what systemic racism is. We certainly understand the feelings and those ugly interactions that often happen, but there's a much bigger picture of racism that we want to talk about today, to explore why these things happen and continue to happen, and why it's so firmly embedded in our society, and why we keep having these experiences that we call racism. And so let's see what else. I want to just highlight kind of where I'm heading with this conversation today is to eventually talk about that this journey of addressing racism and embracing critical consciousness is really something that becomes life-giving. It provides an understanding of the dynamics in which we live in and deal with all the time. And it actually helps to provide strategies that can produce transformative change, and that, in my experience, is life-giving. It also changes when you have this kind of understanding and you embrace critical consciousness, it also changes the dynamics around relationships, and you start to realize that you're embracing authentic relationships, and that's really meaningful for that interpersonal thing, as well as yourself. You start to understand yourself better, and so you understand where and why you carry things the way you do, and then you explore and embrace strategies for change, and that often is very healthy and becomes what we call life-giving. It's a life-giving process. So that's where we're heading today, and we'll talk more about that as we go. And again, just talking about this format of discussion in this way, we want to make sure that we provide time for comments and questions and thoughts, because that's the interaction is what's really important in all of this. So I'm looking forward to hearing from you folks out there as well. So a little bit about myself. As was mentioned, I'm originally from Saskatchewan, and my father is Dakota, Ihanktuwin Dakota, and my mother is what she would call Soto, which is a part of the Ojibwe people, the Anishinaabe Nation. I'm not going to talk a lot about the history of Dakota people or Ojibwe people, but certainly want to say at this point is that it's very similar to many of us Indigenous people here in Canada, a history of forced removal, forced confinement, certainly with Dakota people and our interactions with the United States and my people coming from the area that's called Minnesota. We often refer to a part of our history as the ethnic cleansing of Minnesota, where my ancestors had to flee Minnesota because there was this process of trying to eradicate the Dakota people from that area of what's now called the United States, which was our traditional territory, of course. And so many of us who are Indigenous here have that very same experience of either being forcibly removed from traditional territory or confined within your territory, or not even being able to be in your traditional territory anymore. So we share that root as far as Indigenous people here in Canada. I grew up, not really knowing about this history. Both my parents are survivors of Indian residential school, and certainly the impact of reservation life, reserve life, and Indian hospitals, and all kinds of different influences on my life is a part of my roots. But I didn't know a lot about that as I was growing up. And it's only when I started to embrace what you can call a critical consciousness journey that you begin to realize that those things are so important to know about in order to understand yourself and to understand the dynamics around you and what we're dealing with, and to strategize for what's a good way forward and what's a healthy way of walking in this world. You kind of have to know where you came from in order to address those impacts. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But it wasn't until I got to my early 20s, again through the influence of people like my partner, Sue, in our journey together as a married couple, we started to, and she's non-Indigenous, we started to embrace trying to understand, so what are we up against here, and that got us involved through our work addressing Indigenous rights in the United States. We found ourselves living on Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, where we learned a whole lot about the current reality of continued treaty violations, continued acts of overt racism and the systemic nature of oppression, And we met so many people that were trying to do something about it and raising this as an issue, and so as issues, so we got involved in doing Indigenous rights advocacy and activism, and that really opened my eyes to this colonial context in which we live as Indigenous people all over the world, really, but certainly for me here in Turtle Island, in the U.S. and Canada. And that also got me involved in trying to understand some of the systemic nature of oppression. So that got me involved in trying to address things like racism. So I eventually became a trainer in anti-racism and anti-oppression. And again, I lift my hands up to the many people that I walked along with that helped me to understand as well, and gave me a framework for understanding the systemic nature of oppression and racism. So that was a big influence in my life, and I continue to do that kind of work and bring that kind of understanding to everything that I do. And that also got me involved in trying to understand conflict, and I got involved in something called Restorative Justice, and in particular looking to circles, which is an Indigenous process that can be found all over the world, that tries to embrace conflict in a different way. It tries to bring everybody involved in a conflict together in a safe way. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in order to create a safe place for everybody to come together, and there has to be, elements there that are really important, like people that have done the harm want to be able. They need to want to be there and want to address and make things right, the harms that they have done. So I got involved in that and looking at the issue of conflict, both at an interpersonal level, and then as it connects to a system of oppression, understanding it at a macro level as well. And I'll talk about that in a few moments at the macro level of conflict, and how we're still living and steeped in conflict.
Just a reminder for those joining from the video conference, if you can put your sound on mute, that would be great. Thank you.
And then, in looking at this history of colonialism and trying to understand it, you start to understand that we're dealing with trauma. There's unresolved traumas in our lives, and it's it includes trauma that we've experienced as individuals, as children and as adults, and that may be in our experience of
Hello, those in health sick there in the room. If you just put your sound on mute, that would be great. Not sure she heard me.
Yeah.
I'm texting you.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, we'll take care of the background noise here in a few moments. So that became a big part of my journey as well, trying to understand trauma, which led me to what can be called a trauma-informed practice or a trauma-informed understanding of life, and incorporating that understanding. And again, both at a personal level, I had to understand the impacts of the traumas that I've experienced, and to figure out a way of not just coping with them, but how do I actually heal from trauma? And really, that's the process of critical consciousness. And if you understand a little bit about the neurobiology around trauma, it gets trapped in one side of our brain, and so we actually have to create new neural pathways to incorporate the trauma story in our life, so that we are not triggered by it. That we don't go to that place of fight, flight, or freeze because we're triggered. And so really, that's a process of critical consciousness, of embracing and understanding of that trauma and where it came from, how it's showing up and manifesting in your life, but then incorporating it into your brain, so you're using both sides of your brain so that it doesn't control your life anymore. That's really what healing is. And for me, a trauma-informed practice, understanding becomes really vital to myself and to this journey. And then lastly, in the last 4 years, I've become a cultural safety facilitator for Island Health on Vancouver Island, and a big hello to all my staff, all my colleagues there, and staff that have joined this call today. And again, this is an area where I continue to learn, and actually throughout today, you'll through this talk, you'll hear me often say we, and I say that intentionally because this isn't just about my own understanding. It's nurtured because of all of the relationships that I have at work, at Island Health, doing cultural safety work, and with my friends and my family, and all of those things. They all influence me and help me to understand critically what's going on in our environment, and we test things with each other, and we talk through things, and we debrief, and we engage in conversation and dialogue to try to understand these dynamics better. And so cultural safety has become something that really incorporates all of these understandings. Cultural safety work really involves understanding yourself and where you've come from, your biases and your attitudes and your behaviors, and understanding if it's pointing out to you that perhaps you're doing things in ways that aren't about authentic relationship and maybe are about power over and that kind of things. It explores, so why is that? Where does that come from? And what can we do about it? What kind of skills can we incorporate to adjust those things at a personal level? It also brings in the aspect of understanding the current realities of Indigenous people. And so you become almost like an advocate, or at least somebody that understands these dynamics and its impacts on Indigenous people every day. And a good example of that is the two recent court cases with Colton Bushy and Tina Fontaine. The two tragic experiences and the outcome through the court system, through the justice system, that went to not guilty verdicts, are so impacting on Indigenous people and allies. Those things affect us right in the moment, and we carry that with us for the day. And so understanding those kind of dynamics when you're working with perhaps an Indigenous client, knowing that helps you understand and show up differently for that person in that moment. So you become aware of those kinds of dynamics and of what's going on in the world around you when you embrace a cultural safety journey. And then, of course, understanding the power dynamics is so important in cultural safety. And so understanding racism as systemic, the systemic nature of it, and other oppressions as well. Sexism, it's just so important to remember, or to understand those kind of dynamics so that we can create culturally safe settings for people. And then also understanding conflict, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few moments. But incorporating an understanding of what's going on with people, both at an interpersonal level and a macro level. And I'll save some more words for that in just a few moments here. And then, of course, understanding trauma. It becomes so important in the cultural safety journey. So I just want to say this now, just going to the macro level of things. This is what I believe from my experience.
So we just had some sound.
So this is what I believe from my journey of understanding the context in which we work. I believe that we're living in what I would call an intractable conflict setting here in Canada. And that's because the initial interaction with Indigenous people in this part of the world and European descent people and nations, it was conflictual, in nature. Maybe for the first few years it wasn't. Maybe there was an aspect of being, there helping European people live on this land in ways that ensured their survival. But very quickly it went to what I would call a conflict situation, and ugly interactions, and of course we can talk about the genocidal proportions of those interactions over the few hundred years. But I believe that we haven't moved away from that. We haven't found a way of solving that or resolving that conflict situation. So I believe that we still live in that situation, and unfortunately and sadly, it's become normalized. We don't even see it anymore. It's just a part of the Canadian fabric that this is the way that the original people of these lands live. That we have, we're considered status, and that's defined by somebody else. There's reserves, that we now call First Nations communities, but in essence, they're still a segregationist way of thinking, right? And but we just consider that normal. It's just a part of Canada. So that's an aspect of intractable conflict, is that it becomes normalized. You don't even see it anymore. And another aspect of an intractable conflict situation is that for one party, especially for one party, that there is this sense that there's something wrong, that we have these grievances that have never been resolved, and that the current hardships and realities need to be addressed. And we hear that, and we see that in the many protests and the movements that have come and gone and that are currently with us, that we're trying to say that there's something wrong here. And Idle No More is a profound movement that's trying to address that something needs to change, because it was normalized, right? People were idle with it, and then we'll be idle no more. We're going to raise this up and make sure that people know that these grievances and the current hardship realities are still there, and they've never been addressed. And then in an intractable conflict situation, it often involves such things as identity and sovereignty, values and beliefs. And I would say that that's very much an aspect of our situation here. And that the relationships are often polarized, and there's perceptions of hostility and enmity, and that the behaviors that have become normalized can be seen as violent and destructive, and that becomes normalized as well. That the violence and the destruction that Indigenous people experience just becomes, again, a normal part of everyday living. And in fact, sometimes, or a lot of times, Indigenous people are blamed for it themselves. Right? So that's why I'm saying that we are living in this intractable conflict setting. And I know that's not an easy thing to hear. And I like to say this when I talk about this intractable conflict setting that we find ourselves in, that even though that may sound hopeless, that if we can apply conflict transformational strategies, then we can actually get somewhere. If we define our situation as this, then we can actually start applying strategies that we know about. Many people can work in these kinds of situations. We can start applying those kind of strategies and actually create some change. So that's where I find hope, even in what could be called a hopeless situation in this intractable conflict setting. So I want to talk a little bit now about this journey, and it's kind of a funny place to start, if you will, describing Canada as an intractable conflict situation, because that's not something that I was born with and understood, or that I was taught in school, or that my parents and community talked about. I had to learn that through a process of critical consciousness to come to this understanding, right? And so it's an interesting place to start. Because my starting point in my own journey as an individual is not at this point. Really, as a young man growing up in Saskatchewan to Indigenous parents and living for the most part in white communities, my understanding of life was actually quite a confused one. I was raised to believe in meritocracy. The harder you work, the better off you'll be, the more you'll fit in. And even though we were encouraged and we did live this way and strove to be good citizens and a part of the community, there was still that aspect of we didn't quite fit in, and that there was something different about us. Or if we did, perform in such a way that we were excelling, we were considered unique. and special, or one of the good ones. And we were juxtaposed against the stereotype of Indigenous people that we didn't possibly fit that stereotype, but it was because we were unique. And people didn't paint all Indigenous people as hardworking because of their interaction with us. So there was something bigger going on there that I didn't understand, but certainly felt. I always felt that there was something wrong and something was amiss in all of this. So, and I'd like to say too that the cost of engaging in life in that way has to do with relationships with our own people, with our own relatives. You know, this intractable conflict situation, the impacts of intergenerational trauma through residential schools and Indian hospitals and reserve life has an effect and impact on our relationships. And rather than trying to figure that out and work with that, when you embrace a journey of meritocracy and all of that and individualism that we find in Western society, those relationships get left behind and they're not tended to and they're not worked on as far as healing the broken relationships goes. So there is a cost to embracing that understanding. So really critical consciousness for me is trying to answer the question why. Why did I have this feeling? Why did I find these really they were lies. You know, you're told in this society if you just work hard, you put your nose to the grindstone and pull yourself up by the bootstraps, that everything will be okay. But you begin to realize that that's not the case, that something is wrong. So really critical consciousness is about trying to answer the question why. Why is this happening? And so, and often I want to say that this journey starts with self. You know, that you start to look at yourself, or you start to realize that all of these things have an impact on yourself, and you can actually find some helpful processes and understandings from the Western worldview, because the Western worldview is often focused on self, right, and individualism, so that there's both the negative side of that, of being kind of self-centered, but then there's also this aspect of that we can focus on peeling back the layers of the impacts on ourself. And then how I've been socialized and impacted by colonial worldview and Western values. You know, I think of the work here of Dr. Verna St. Denis, who talks about critical race theory, and she's been a long time, over 30 years, educator around cultural safety and anti-racism, and she talks about in some of her work about for we as Indigenous people, sometimes we don't like to talk about those impacts on our lives, especially around things like Christianity and even colonialism, that we want to be seen as bigger than that, or that it hasn't affected that us in any way, and that we remain strong and connected to our traditions and therefore not impacted in any way. And I think for myself in this journey of critical consciousness, I had to embrace the understanding that I have been impacted by all of these things, and that's not an easy place to go sometimes, because it can be an ugly and difficult area to look into your own life. But certainly had to look at those things and understand that they've impacted me in a lot of different ways.
Can you just repeat the name of the researcher you mentioned?
Sure, Dr. Verna St. Denis. Mm-hmm. And so, and I mentioned this earlier about focusing on feelings and emotions, noticing the impacts on your body and those kinds of things becomes a really important part. And again, I want to lift my hands up and thank people like my partner, who helped me to understand the importance of emotions and feelings and vulnerability. and you know, I recognize my own sexism that I carry in this, and that's been a part of my own critical consciousness journey, is to recognize, so how have I been socialized in this world, and how do I appear and show up in this world? So I identify as male, and so in my journey of understanding systemic oppression and power dynamics, I have to recognize that I've been impacted and socialized to be sexist in this world. And part of that is that socialization are lies towards us as men. And one of those things is around not showing our feelings and not recognizing emotions as very important to who we are as human beings. And it's been people like my partner and other, mostly women, not just women, there's been men too that have helped me to understand the importance of vulnerability and to understand the power of vulnerability, because it's a part of who we are as human beings. And so accessing that and nurturing that really makes us fuller human beings, and that we can see and embrace the world in different ways and in profound ways when we access that. So it's really important to the part of critical consciousness. The journey of critical consciousness is very much attached to feelings and emotions. And I think just the name critical consciousness sometimes has us thinking about it only in our heads, that it's a process of education at an intellectual level. But really we have to figure out how to embrace who we are in a holistic way as part of that critical consciousness journey. And then understanding trauma and its impacts at a personal level it becomes so important, and at a personal experience level, understanding the intergenerational and historical aspects and its impacts on myself. And then, like I mentioned earlier, figuring out how do I actually heal from these things. And so how do I take this journey of trying to understand how trauma shows up in our bodies, not only in its impacts, but what's going on in our minds, in our brains, when we're living with unresolved trauma. And that really is about critical consciousness. It's about learning about the way that our brain functions in a neurobiological way. That helps provide answers to why. Why do we go to fight, flight, or freeze when we're triggered? Why do all those chemicals course through our body when we're triggered, right? And so and why is it so profound to us when we're triggered and we go into shock sometimes, or we run, or we fight things, or we just freeze. So that process of understanding those things becomes really important to this journey as well. And understanding isn't enough, that healing is required. How do we actually embrace all of this in a way that impacts who we are holistically as human beings? And then what's been really important for me, and as I've learned more about who I am as an Indigenous person and looking to what I call the genius and brilliance of Indigenous ways, and certainly my journey into restorative justice and using the circle process for that has been really, really helpful to understand the collective, how we peel back the layers as a collective, and how we carry things as a collective as well, and how we've experienced things as a collective, as Indigenous peoples and as specific nations and groups of people and extended families and families. Understanding all of those dynamics at a collective level becomes really important in this journey as well. And so I just want to say here that an analysis of racism and its connection to other isms becomes really important. And I want to focus on the analysis portion. Finding some way of framing all of this becomes really important to the journey of, or how is another way of talking about critical consciousness. Working from an analysis, of looking at something and having a framework for understanding its function is really important. And let me just say really quickly here about one piece of an analysis that has become really important to me in my journey of understanding racism. So in the way that I think about it and my analysis, I incorporate a metaphor of an iceberg. And so what we know about an iceberg is that 10% of it is what we see above the water, and there's 90% of the iceberg underneath the water. So that's a really good metaphor for understanding racism, because for the most part, what we know about racism I would say globally, is what we see in the news and our own experiences. So those negative interactions, those ugly interactions, and the things that we see on the news around police brutality or hate crimes or bullying based on skin color and ethnicity and those kinds of things. That's what we know. And it's very true. We need to know those things, right? But if we don't understand racism at a systemic level of how our institutions do their work, whether it's family or spirituality or health or education or justice system, if we don't understand how it functions and how it does its work is based on solely a Western worldview. If we don't understand that, then we won't address the issues that provide for the tip of the iceberg things to happen. And then even at a lower level, so when we use this iceberg metaphor, we talk about the institutional ways of doing things as the middle of the iceberg. And down at the bottom, and the most difficult part to see and get to is our own belief systems and its impacts on us, and actually the impacts of racism and other isms on ourselves as human beings. So in a construct of systemic racism, what's really at the very bottom of the racism is this core belief that for some people who are racialized in a certain way or racialized white, that it's just normal to consider that this is the way we do things, and it's the best way of doing things. So it creates a sense of superiority, and for people that don't fit that paradigm, it embeds this understanding that we're inferior, that there's something wrong with us. And that's the real nastiness of racism, is that it has us believing and walking our lives in that way. And so I wanted to point this out because what happens if you only have the tip of the iceberg understanding of racism, then all of your ways of addressing it are going to be there and focused there. And so you're going to do things like sensitivity trainings, how do we just get along, and diversity is often pointed there, how do we just get along, but it doesn't address the power dynamics, right? For the most part, if you don't put your face into the water and understand that there's systemic misuse of power going on as well. And so that's why this metaphor becomes really important, because it's not that things like diversity and cultural awareness are not important. In fact, it's a part of the address, but we're not, for the most part, doing things that get down to the lower levels of the metaphor of racism using the iceberg. And for the work that we're doing, and I'm sure that many of you folks out there are talking about Indigenous specific racism, and this becomes really important here in this context, and it goes back to that intractable conflict situation that I talked about earlier, because Indigenous specific racism brings in the aspect of the land. The land is so much a part of who we are as Indigenous people, and our relationships with that land have been broken, not by our own accord, but because of the process of colonization here in this land, here in this part of the world. And so, and from that flows all of the outcomes that we deal with now. This breaking of relationship, or for forced confinement or forced removal from the land. Becomes so much a part of racism. And I would say too that if we can understand racism from an Indigenous specific perspective, it helps us to understand better racism in general that other people experience, because we're all racialized in the paradigm of racism. White folks are racialized, people of color are racialized, Indigenous people are racialized. We're all racialized in some way. And so if we understand the Indigenous perspective of it, it actually helps us understand the larger issue of racism as well. And I'll talk a little bit about that here in a few moments. because it's connected to the process of colonization, which is a global phenomenon. And there's been different periods of colonization. If you look into the history of the world, you'll see different periods and different processes that have happened all over the world that involve colonization. So I just want to share here really quickly about colonization and the connection to the Doctrine of Discovery. In our work with our cultural safety work with Island Health, we delve into and we talk about the Doctrine of Discovery. And it's really important for us because we want people to see that the way that we end up treating each other, when we talk about racism as those ugly interactions, we often say that that's just human nature. But we want to show the history of racism and colonization so that people understand that there's systems in place that perpetuate these ugly interactions and structures, So we look to this thing called the Doctrine of Discovery, and oftentimes we ask in our training settings how many people have heard of the Doctrine of Discovery, and it's very seldom that somebody will put up their hand to say that they've heard of it. And the Doctrine of Discovery is mentioned in the TRC calls to action. It's mentioned in various other documents of its importance, and it's often called the legal and moral apparatus that has allowed for modern day colonization as we know it today. And so the Doctrine of Discovery is basically a series of papal bulls that were issued in the 14th century over a number of decades that set up the apparatus of colonization. So it did things like, for instance, one of the first papal bulls that was issued by the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church was, at that time in world history, had a lot of power and influence in Europe, right? And so it was kind of an overarching power of all of the different nations of the day, Portugal and Spain and France, those nations. So when Europe was starting to run out of resources and needing and wanting more land and resources and that kind of thing, and sent out people to find these places, they had a problem. And that was when they so-called discovered new lands, and I'm saying this sarcastically, there were people there. So what do you do with the people? So going back to the Pope and the powers of the day, they talked about it, and what the popes did was that they issued these papal bulls, and one of the first ones was basically it said, if you discover that there's people on this land, if they're not Christians and you don't understand, or they don't have a form of government that you recognize, then they're not fully human. So therefore, then you can do all kinds of terrible things to them because they're not fully human. You're relieved of your moral dilemma because they're not fully human. And then claiming the land in the name of whatever nation or sovereign that you're representing, the real insidious part of that is that it becomes international law. So the Doctrine of Discovery is still used to this day in supreme courts in colonial countries as precedents for the way that European nations have interacted and therefore influenced the way of understanding law and property and all of those things, and the treatment of Indigenous people is based on this doctrine that it was established in the 14th century. And there's other aspects to it as well. There's a reason why Portuguese is spoken in certain parts of the world and why Spanish and others and all of that. It's because of the Doctrine of Discovery. There's actually a papal bull that divvied up the land to these various sovereign nations, European sovereign nations. So we point that out because we want people to understand that there's still these structures of abuse of power, that have abused power, that have had these effects of genocidal proportions that still impact us to this day, that are still around us. And the last thing that I'll say about the Doctrine of Discovery and its insidiousness is that there's often a Latin byline that's attached to the Doctrine of Discovery, and it's called terra nullius, which basically means empty land. The land is devoid of life. And for the most part, people talk about that as that there aren't people there, and so then you can take the resources and that kind of thing. But really, in my mind, what's really insidious about that is that if you look at the process of colonization, one of its aspects is that it's about subjugating the people, it's about taking the land and resources, but it's also about changing the worldview of the Indigenous people so that they begin to participate in your system. And so the Doctrine of Discovery and terra nullius to me also means that the land was devoid of life. And so for Indigenous people who think of and thought of at that time land as relative, land as mother, land as a part of you, and you as part of the land, you had to break that worldview. And so I think terra nullius is another word for breaking that relationship with the land. And really for most Indigenous cultures throughout the world, land had a feminine aspect to it. And so in my way of thinking about this, if you break that relationship with the sacred feminine, the next step is breaking that relationship with women. That it flows from there, this worldview that changes the way that we think about and incorporate our relatives and incorporate a power over and an abusive power system. So it's really important for us to talk about this to show that these things are still around to this day. And I know this sounds hopeless, but I also want to point out that there's a movement that's going on. Several of the Christian churches and larger organizations have actually been working on it, and of course Indigenous people have been pushing for this, is that they've started to issue statements of repudiation on the Doctrine of Discovery. And some churches have also established programs recognizing that they were a part of this process and they don't want to be a part of it anymore. So as we bring awareness to this, we can actually start to create movements that will address things like this, these structures of power abuse. Just looking at the time here. So working from I mentioned this already, working from an analysis of systemic racism is another way to frame critical consciousness. And it's a way forward that includes more than the tip of the iceberg approaches. And the benefits of working from a systemic analysis for the individual, I mentioned that already. For me, it was about healing. How do I actually heal from this, and I'm not trying to say that I'm fully healed, because I think I will be continuing to heal, and hopefully the healing that I do on myself will impact my children and so on, because I think it's going to take several generations for us to fully heal and to reincorporate our traditional understandings in a full and wholesome way, so that our structures are influenced by that way of thinking as well. I think we have so far to go. I think we're just scratching the surface on what that means to actually heal. So that's the benefit of working this working on critical consciousness at a personal level and a systemic analysis. And again, I'll just say that one of the huge benefits of this, when I talk about my own sexism and how I've bought into that system and have been influenced by it, and now as I try to address it, and again I still have a long way to go, and when I talk about it, I say it not to denigrate men, because what I've discovered in this journey is that the relationships that I have now with women and even the femininity within myself has nurtured me in profound ways, and it's helping me to become a fuller human being, and that changes the relationships that I have with women and with femininity, and it's made my life so much richer to be on this journey. So even though it's hard to root out these things, there's a payoff, and that's the richness of relationships that come from that. And I want to talk about the life-giving aspect of this. It's something that I firmly believed in for many years, and again, Dr. Verna St. Denis talks about that as well, that it's for Indigenous people especially, taking a journey of understanding racism, having an anti-racist understanding of this world is life-giving. And for me, it's because it provides answers to the question, why? Why is it like this? Why am I like this? Why do we continue to be treated this way? Why does it have to be this way? This systemic analysis provides a way of seeing the world in a life-giving way, because it provides answers. And then again, when you join with others on this journey, it creates this place that you can be with others who are also on this journey. You can strategize in different ways, and you can see some really I think transformation happens when you embrace this kind of way of being. So that's from the collective. That's the collective benefit for this. And I mentioned this about the transformational aspect. And in the work that we've been doing on Vancouver Island, we've started to ask the question not only of Indigenous people or talk about anti-racism education and process as life-giving to Indigenous people. We've actually asked some of our allies who are racialized as white, so what is it like for you? And the word that we heard was it's transformational. It's created a new way of being in the world, and even though it's hard and it's difficult and there's many challenges to it, that transformational part of it becomes something that's profound for their journey of embracing this kind of systemic understanding and analysis. And I think I'm almost to the end of my. I think the last thing that I'll talk about is the role of vulnerability. And I talked about it earlier already. We like the work of Brené Brown, who talks about vulnerability a lot, and we tell the story of how in one of her TED Talks she says, from a couple of years ago, she says that the biggest, and she's from Texas, right, and so she's talking about the U.S. Context, and she says that one of the biggest issues facing the U.S. is racism. And she says, but they're not having deep conversation around racism, the systemic understanding. The folks aren't embracing that dialogue and that conversation. And she says her understanding through understanding vulnerability is because in order to talk about systemic racism, you're going to have to talk about privilege. But who wants to talk about privilege when it's so guilt and shame producing? And I certainly understand that as a male in this society. I have to reckon that aspect that I can do so many things and feel safe, not even worry about doing things simply because I'm male, whereas women a lot of times will feel unsafe or deal with microaggressions daily that I don't see, I don't notice, I don't have to deal with, simply because of the systemic sexism that we live in. But I have to deal with that guilt and shame that it produces in me. And so we're not going to those places because of guilt and shame. And she says that guilt and shame is held in place by three things: by silence, by secrets, and by judgment. Mm-hmm. And so I think you can see that within our Indigenous experience here in Canada, where we didn't know for the most part, and probably still don't know, about things like residential schools that are so impacting on our lives. But for the most part, Canadians didn't know about that era. It was kept secret. It was covered up. And then our voices have been silenced because we don't fit into the norm, what's considered the normal way of doing things. So our voices don't even get to access places to tell our stories because we don't fit in. We don't talk about things in the same way. Our processes are different. So our voices are literally silenced and are not a part of the structures around us. And then judgment, those stories that go through our head that we've been socialized to believe that it's Indigenous people's fault. It's not that Indigenous people have been hard done by. So this is the narrative that's out there in Canada. It's because Canada's been too benevolent, too good to them. It's given them too much. It's created this part of society that's dependent, right? So that's the narrative that quickly goes into your brain that explains away everything, and so then things continue and nothing gets changed. And so vulnerability becomes really important in all of this, because Brené Brown says that vulnerability is the antidote to shame. So if we can have these places where we're actually embracing this difficult journey and recognizing our own place in it, and we can move towards what Brené Brown says is that vulnerability is the gateway to creativity and innovation. So if we actually want to create and be innovative for change and transformation, then vulnerability is our gateway. It's about truth telling. And it's about looking within ourselves to see what we carry and what we can do to actually change in creative and innovative ways together. So that's what, and I also want to say that I believe that culture or vulnerability is an act of humility. And I want to say this too, that humility from an Indigenous perspective is not a sign of weakness. It's not a meekness. Humility, if you look at it, and even in the English word, its roots are talking about the earth. It's humus. And I remember one of the influences in my life, an older wise person said one time, "Be humble like the earth." And it took me many years to figure out what he was saying. But I think what he was saying is the earth is a macrocosm of connections. Right? And there's so much strength in those connections. It's really only because of those connections and the interconnectivity and the mutuality in those connections that there's this tremendous strength. So humility is about remembering that we're connected, and that to me is strength. It's not weakness. So vulnerability is a way of remembering that and talking about those connections and talking about the connections to even the negativity in our lives and the influences, the negative influences, and exposing them and working together to figure out what we can do about them and to heal. And really, to me, that's what resiliency is. It comes from our teachings, it comes from our languages, it comes from our ceremonies and that kind of thing, and it also comes from our connections to one another as we work together to address these things. It's building resiliency. Resiliency is something that influences our life, that puts something within us where there's strength, that we can walk with that strength, but it comes from the influencing of all of those things that I mentioned. And this is the last thing that I'll say. It's the last point, and this comes from my a conversation that I was having with on a walk with my partner and I, our oldest daughter. Her name is Makapia, and we were walking in our town, and we were trying to figure out. We were trying to figure out how to characterize the Western world, and we were talking about all of its kind of its negativity and its influences on things like mental health and depression and anxiety. And so what's going on in this world that has it flowing in this real fast pace that we don't pay attention to relationships with each other and with Earth and all of those things. What is it? How can we characterize that? And so we came up with that it's self-centered, very individualistic in an unhealthy way. So it's self-centered. And so then we thought, so what about Indigenous worldview, in its beauty and strength and trying to wade through all of the influences that we've had on us, but at its core, what was the Indigenous worldview? And we thought about it as centered self. It was about making sure that your well-being was well, and from an understanding of that we're centered, but centered to something. There's other pieces all around us. There's the world around us, our relatives, our traditions, our languages, all of those things. But making sure that we are centered within that. So it's about, for us, it was about healing. So how do we make sure that we're centered in all of this in a healthy way, in a holistic way? So for me, that's what critical consciousness is about. It's about figuring out how we become that centered self person, so that we can join with others on this journey to address the many different things that we need to address in the society that we find ourselves in. And I think that's all I have to say other than questions and answers.
Okay. Well, thank you, Harley. Such an important topic for all of us in this country, not just Indigenous people, but all of us, and the importance of looking at it from that individual side as well as the whole system, and how we can move away from having things be normalized that should not be normalized. And I really loved what you said about the teaching that you shared about humility, and that connection that we all have. So we're going to open it up for questions, and also any reflections or comments you might have. You can pop those in the chat box, and I'll relay them to Harley. And also in the video conference rooms, we've got one room there. If you have a question, maybe wave at me and we can put you, or you can put yourself off mute. So any questions or comments at this time? Okay, so we've got a question here. Could you help me understand anti-racism versus diversity?
Yeah, and so I would suggest, if you want to look more into it, to look to the work of Dr. Verna St. Denis, who does a wonderful job of framing it, and does some really in-depth work of understanding of how the differences. And I really like what she calls culturally responsive education, which is about looking to helping people understand, I guess, understanding the world and the situation by looking to the cultural practices. So whether it's interacting with cultural practices, dances and ceremony and language and that kind of thing, looking to Indigenous people to provide that for other people or an organization, can kind of be seen as a diversity approach, right? It's about bringing in other ways of seeing things. And I appreciate that Verna St. Denis says that, not that that's wrong, that's we've been doing that for many years now. And in one of her writings she says, but perhaps it hasn't had the effect that we wanted it to. We wanted people to see the genius and brilliance of Indigenous ways, with the hope that it would impact the system around us. And so it does. It gets to show that genius and brilliance of who we are as Indigenous people. But if we don't address the power structures, the abusive power structures, that's the main difference between a diversity approach and an anti-racism approach. Is anti-racism will look at the power structures and the history of how they came to be. For instance, how I talked earlier about the Doctrine of Discovery. So that whole era, back a few hundred years ago, when it's incorporated such understandings as if you didn't recognize the Indigenous people's form of government, or that they weren't Christians and they weren't fully humans, well, after a few decades there was a problem, because Indigenous people started to become Christians. And then they started to incorporate Western ways of being into their society. So now they fit the paradigm of people. But you still have to have a way of denigrating them, of dehumanizing them. And so really that's where the understanding of race came into being. Because race as a construct is, that we're somehow different at a really profound way because of the color of our skin. That's a fairly recent concept. It started in around the 1700s with scientists that were actually encouraged, I'll say, by sovereign nations and by the Catholic Church. And they looked to scientists that what I call were heavy hitters in the scientific world. People like Linnaeus, who was known as the father of modern day zoology. He's the guy that came up with a classification system of animals, right? So he was employed by the sovereign, the monarch that was supporting his work, and the Catholic Church, to come up with a construct that would classify human beings, because there wasn't one before. we were all the human race. So he tried, and at first he came up with four categories, so Caucasian, Mongoloid, Australioid, and Negroid. And they did all kinds of tests to try to prove that there's difference, that one group was more moral and had better character and more intelligence than the others. They couldn't prove it. And then they went to 8. They tried to prove that. They couldn't prove it. Then 16, and so on and so on. And they ended up with well over 100 different categories of race for human beings. They could never prove it because you can't prove that. It's not true. That we're all the human race, and we're not separated by skin color, saying that we're smarter or have more character or more moral. It doesn't hold up. In fact, there's more difference between myself and somebody that looks like me, skin color wise, than there is between me and somebody who's racialized as white. It doesn't have anything to do with skin color. But the problem was that these heavy hitters in the scientific world were writing about it and issuing these theories. And so it got out there, and it supported the notion that people of color and Indigenous people were less intelligent, weren't intellectually or morally capable of being at the forefront of this process of civilization. And so what we often say is that race is a myth, but racism is true. And so that's what this process of racism helps us to understand, those kinds of dynamics, where you might not get that within a diversity understanding. It won't trouble the power dynamics and the hierarchies that we find ourselves in based on a system of race. So I hope that helps.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I've got a comment and a question here. So one, I found your connection between the disrespect, devaluing of our Mother Earth to the issue of sexism really interesting. Harley will be back next week to talk more about male privilege. That'll be part of that.
Yeah.
From another person here, I'm wondering if you have thoughts on how non-Indigenous people can be encouraged and directed to do their homework when it comes to decolonizing themselves and learning how to listen better. I want to find a balance between having Indigenous folks lead these initiatives, but without Indigenous people taking on the brunt of the emotional labor it takes to educate non-Indigenous people. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really profound question, and one that we need to figure out, because we get what they call racial battle fatigue, right, for always having to be out front and doing this work. And so again, an anti-racism approach helps with that understanding that we're all racialized and that we actually all have been harmed in some way. And just as how I talk about my sexism, even though I can so easily perpetuate sexism, and I would say that I still do, but I'm trying to figure it out. I'm trying to make some change. So even though I am implicated in the system of sexism simply because I'm male, because I've been able to look at the power behind that and the power that I carry, even though I don't want it, I still carry it. It also provides me accountability and responsibility. And so that's from a systemic understanding of misuse of power. So that's what an anti-racism approach can provide for folks that are racialized white, is finding their responsibility and how they can hold themselves accountable to the larger work of undoing racism. And so and for me it's about two things, and how do you actually do that? There's this article, if you get a chance to read it, it's called the Neuroscience of Leadership. The Neuroscience of Leadership, and I don't recall who the author is, but it's about business. But in it, they talk about this, about how for some companies, they've been able to incorporate and help with transformation of, incorporating a new way of being for a business, an organization, while others often fail at that. and oftentimes there's a backlash when it's suggested for change. And so this article focuses on, so what's going on in people's brains when it's suggested that they need to change. And it talks about that change is pain. That actually when we get so used to doing things in a certain way, even if it's wrong, even if it's a process that's about systemic abuse of power, but because our habits have been going for so long, it's actually a part of our brain where it doesn't require a lot of energy, helps to keep that going. We don't even have to think about it. It's like driving a car, and you don't even really have to think, I have to do this in every moment. You just do it because it's gone to a part of your brain that actually facilitates that. But when you suggest change, it's stimulating a part of your brain that requires a lot of energy, and it's actually right near the part of your brain that's about fight, or freeze. And so that's what happens, and it's about vulnerability as well. And it's about that shame piece that Brené Brown talked about. It's about the process of engaging with this type of material and this kind of understanding. How do we engage with this material in a way that actually gets a person internally motivated to say, I want to do something about it. So for me, it's about a process. What's the appropriate process that actually engages with people where they're able to look at the challenging and uncomfortable material and not run away from it, not flee from it, and not fight it, and not freeze because of it. So it's about process. And for myself, I'll just say this, a part of this for me in doing this work is, again, about the genius and brilliance of Indigenous ways and the circle process. You know, the circle process is one way of accessing people in a different way than this, you know, a webinar or a lecture, but it's a way about coming together in a really practical way as who we are as human beings, so that we can provide learning. And that people can engage with their own understanding. And, you know, we often call circles talking circles. Really, they're listening circles. We spend so much time listening and not a lot of time talking. And really, we end up listening to ourselves, because everything we hear goes through our filters that we have, kind of that habit is so ingrained in us. And so finding a way of actually becoming a critical thinker, the circle can provide that, because you end up sitting a lot and listening, and if you can get into the practice of listening to yourself and your own filters, you can start to question yourself and your own thinking, and to ask the question, so where did this come from? Why do I think this way? And I think that's what's important in this work, to get folks that are racialized as white, is how do we get them to that place that they start questioning their own way of thinking, their own belief system? But it has to be done in a very careful way, right? Otherwise, we'll have people running or fighting back or just freezing and not knowing how to move forward with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so important to acknowledge that emotional reaction.
Yeah.
Piece.
Yeah.
Okay, so see you in the conference room, video conference room in Huiston. Do you have any questions?
Oh, we're good. Thank you very much for all your talks today. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Any other questions or comments on the webinar front? We got about 10 minutes left. We've got a thank you. And really like the idea of self-centered to centered self.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be curious your thoughts of how reconciliation fits into this conversation.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because we find ourselves in this era of what's called reconciliation here in Canada, and I think it's a good way of entering into this conversation. It's a point that we can enter in, and actually we see that happening. You know, people that wouldn't have been engaged in this conversation, 10 years ago, or not find themselves engaged because they've come through the TRC or through the understandings of residential schools and now through reconciliation. But I think with the process of critical consciousness, you start to kind of try to expand your understanding of what that means. So we find ourselves here in Canada talking about reconciliation, but really it's only addressing Indian residential schools, and that's really important to address, but there's so much more that we have to uncover. There's so much truth telling and truth finding that we need to go through. And I think that the journey of reconciliation as we find ourselves in here with the TRC can help us. It's a door into that. But keeping the conversations going, keeping the dialogues going, and pulling back the layers, and talking about things like the Indian hospitals, or we have another effort going on right now with the inquiry on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. That can help us peel back the layers onto these things. And I'm saying this also recognizing that these are difficult journeys to go on. I mean, there's so much hurt and pain that we'll find there as well, that again we need to figure out how we can be that centered self in all of this, because there's so many challenging issues, topics, and understandings that we'll need to confront and figure out what to do with. 60 Scoop, the reserve system here in Canada, the governance system, the justice system is something that's really confronting us right now. So peeling back those layers, we can do that by accessing that through the reconciliation process that we find ourselves in now.
Okay, so we've got about 5 minutes left, but we've got a couple of questions in here. So, has there been any previous suggestions about sharing this cultural safety information with members of the public, or even family, friends of Island Health employees? I feel that Vancouver Island Health Authority is doing such a good job at pushing this topic, and Harley and the other team members, but could it be part of educating the public as well, promoting positive spiritual, mental, political, personal, geographic safety? Going back to Spencer's question about encouraging non-Indigenous people to do their part, or prompting them to educate themselves.
Yeah, I mean that's the crux of all of this. How do we take this beyond the institutions and the organizations that we find ourselves in? And I think when I first started doing circles on Pine Ridge Reservation, the Oglala Lakota Nation, I was confronted with this dilemma, because if you know anything about Pine Ridge Reservation, you'll know that it's a place that has a lot of violence. It has a lot of dysfunction because of colonization and the current realities of all of that. It also has this tremendous strength, a lot of traditional people, language, and that kind of thing as well. So I was asked to be a part of kind of a restorative justice movement that was building there. But I had to ask myself the question, restore people to what? Because of the environment that they find themselves in. So what are we restoring people to when there's been this long history of broken relationships, that there isn't a good relationship and setting that was there that we can restore people to. Mm-hmm. So I really had to struggle with that and figure that out. And really where I got to was the process itself of engaging with conflict in a circle helps people to learn a different way. It's about breaking the patterns that we're stuck in of dealing with hurt and pain in one way, right? That's been so harmful to us. If we can provide a way where many of us are dealing with these things in different ways, then we can figure out how to spread it. And I think that's it may sound like a cop-out to the question of how do we spread it, but I think we have to embrace it fully as individuals. And then when you do that, you start to realize that you're connecting with all of these other people, and then it starts to spread as you develop these authentic relationships and these connections. And at the same time, we have to figure out how do we hold our organizations accountable too. How do we help our organizations remember that we're community members as well? So how do we walk as good community members and not just keep our good work that we're doing inside, but also recognize that we're part of a macrocosm. We're part of that systemic systems understanding of things, and so we have to figure out how we be good relatives and good community members beyond that. So I'll finish with this and answering the question. These days I have less answers for people, but I do have a process, a different way of engaging, which helps with encouraging critical thinking, which then helps with encouraging development of different ways of thinking and being by the development of different neural pathways. To me that's what healing is, and I know I'm sounding clinical and Western when I say that, but it's really about tricking the mind into a different way of incorporating this difficult situation we find ourselves in. And again, I believe that our traditional Indigenous ways were full of genius and brilliance on how to do that. The circle is just one way, but our traditional ways help with that different way of walking in this world.
So there's been several thank yous to you and a comment here. So you had asked us to think about which part of this conversation creates a response reaction in us. When you talked about vulnerability, that gave me goosebumps. The idea of self-centered, centered self is something that really resonated with me at this point. It reminded me of a conversation I had with the chief once about leading our life with the intentions of either love of power, power of love. So at this time, I want to thank everyone for joining us today on the webinar and the video conference, and thank our team. Davina's in the room here. She's been responding to some of your questions and helping us out here, and also like to really thank Harley for coming and sharing on such an important topic today, and he'll be continuing the conversation next week, talking on March 8th to talk about structural oppression and male privilege, which is a very interesting conversation to have during International Women's Week. We at the Learning Circle welcome feedback and ideas for future sessions, so please be in contact with us if you have any of that. Look forward to having folks join us again and Harley next week, and we'll be at a different venue next week, so it'll only be a webinar session, but there'll be some people live in the room with us too. So thank you everyone, and I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you.